The heat in Vicksburg sat heavy on the chest, a physical weight that made breathing feel like a labor contract. Cordelia Vance stood on the second-floor balcony of the family mansion, her eyes tracing the muddy churn of the Mississippi River far below. It was September 5th, 1850, a date local historians would later note for its oppressive atmospheric pressure, though Cordelia marked it for different reasons entirely. From her vantage point, she could see the wooden docks where the steamboats docked, their paddle wheels silent for the moment, waiting to take on cargo that included cotton, tobacco, and human beings sold south to New Orleans. She counted the vessels with a practiced eye, a habit born of necessity. 3 boats at the main dock, 2 at the auxiliary slip. Her father, Judge Silas Vance, presided over this river kingdom with the same granite authority he wielded in the courtroom. And today, as every day, the machinery of commerce waited for his judicial blessing to proceed. The Vicksburg Whig had predicted rain, but the sky remained a stubborn, cloudless white, bleaching the color from the world. Cordelia turned from the river view and walked back into the dimness of her bedroom. The room was a shrine to Southern femininity, lace antimacassars, a vanity cluttered with silver brushes, a quilting frame in the corner. But to her, it felt like a cell in a beautifully appointed prison. On the writing desk near the window lay the day's correspondence, including a letter from her aunt in Charleston that smelled of lavender and subtle condescension. The letter spoke of the upcoming social season and the eligibility of various suitors, a clear orchestration by her father to marry her into a dynasty of similar moral bankruptcy. She placed the letter in the fire and watched the paper curl and blacken, feeling no heat from the flames that matched the temperature of her own suppressed rage. Judge Vance's reputation was built on the bedrock of predictability, a quality he prized above mercy. In the 12 years since his appointment to the circuit court, he had sentenced over 200 individuals to various forms of bondage or death, maintaining a conviction rate that had made him a darling of the planter class. Cordelia knew these statistics not from public record, but from the ledgers she kept hidden beneath the floorboards. Her transition from a dutiful daughter to a silent revolutionary had been a slow erosion of faith, beginning when she was 16 and witnessing her first public whipping in the town square. By 21, the naive girl who once recited scripture at her father's knee had been replaced by a woman who saw the devil not in the condemned, but in the man holding the gavel. The town saw a spinster daughter. The truth was far more dangerous. Downstairs, the grandfather clock chimed the half hour, its mechanical song echoing through the high-ceilinged hallway. In 3 hours, the afternoon session would begin, and the judge would deliver his verdicts on the 7 souls currently sitting in the county jail. Cordelia moved to her wardrobe, her fingers brushing against the silk and muslin of her extensive wardrobe, until they found the plain cotton dress she wore for her excursions. It was a garment designed for invisibility, the kind of clothing a poorer relation might wear, allowing her to move through the edges of society without drawing the gaze of the town's elite. Changing clothes was the first step in the transformation, from Cordelia Vance, the judge's daughter, to the shadow that moved through Vicksburg's underbelly. She pinned her hair tightly beneath a straw bonnet, the sharp stab of a hairpin grounding her in the reality of the coming hours. The house slaves moved through the corridors with the practiced silence of ghosts, their eyes averted, their voices lowered to whispers that evaporated before reaching the ears of the master class. Cordelia had learned to read the subtle language of their movements, the way the kitchen staff tightened their jaws when her father rang for breakfast, or how the stable hands hesitated before hitching the carriage to the judge's buggy. This silent communication network had become her primary source of intelligence, a web of whispered warnings and observations that the white hierarchy arrogantly ignored. A young houseboy named Samuel, had slipped her a note the previous evening, a scrap of paper hidden inside a folded napkin, warning that the jail was understaffed during the shift change at dusk. Such intelligence was the currency of her rebellion, traded at the risk of life and limb by people who had far more to lose than she did. The political climate of Mississippi in 1850 was a tinderbox of economic anxiety and paranoid control. The state legislature had recently passed a series of draconian measures designed to curb the influence of Northern abolitionism, including the authorization of $10,000 in rewards for the capture of anyone aiding fugitives. This financial incentive had turned every poor white man in Warren County into a potential bounty hunter, eyes scanning the roads for the flash of a reward. Cordelia understood that her presence in the courtroom today was a necessary risk, a performance designed to allay suspicion by maintaining the appearance of familial solidarity. To avoid the court was to invite scrutiny. To attend was to endure the torture of watching her father dispense his version of justice. She chose the torture, as she always did, gathering her reticule and descending the main staircase with measured, deliberate grace. Her father's study door stood open, revealing the man himself, hunched over a stack of legal briefs, his steel-gray hair catching the light from the window. Judge Silas Vance did not look up as she passed, his pen scratching aggressively across the paper, drafting the death warrants or bills of sale that would soon be read aloud. He smelled of starch and tobacco, the sense of authority that had defined her childhood. There was a time when she had found comfort in that smell, associating it with safety and provision. But now, it turned her stomach. The silence between them had grown into a third presence in the house, a living thing that filled every room and made conversation impossible. He knew she despised him, and she knew he suspected her, but neither was willing to shatter the fragile truce that kept their public image intact. Stepping out into the glare of the midday sun, Cordelia felt the humidity wrap around her, like a wet wool blanket. The walk to the courthouse was short, barely 4 blocks down Washington Street, but it required a careful navigation of social pitfalls. She nodded to the shopkeepers sweeping their boardwalks and avoided the gaze of the young clerks who lingered outside the land offices, hoping to catch a smile from the judge's beautiful daughter. The Vicksburg courthouse loomed ahead, a stark structure of red brick and white columns that seemed to mock the very concept of justice it housed. She could feel the eyes of the town on her, the weight of expectation that she would soon become the wife of some prosperous planter and perpetuate the cycle of ownership that defined their society. Entering the courthouse through the public doors rather than the private family entrance was a deliberate choice, one that forced her to pass through the crowd of spectators gathered for the show. The gallery was already packed with farmers, merchants, and tourists, all drawn by the prospect of seeing human lives weighed and measured. The air inside was thick with the smell of unwashed bodies and tobacco juice, a sharp contrast to the lavender-scented letter she had burned an hour earlier. Cordelia found her usual seat near the front, a spot reserved for the judge's family, and arranged her skirts with practiced precision. She opened the small Bible she carried, not for spiritual comfort, but to hide the trembling of her hands as she counted the empty seats on the defendant's bench. 7 empty chairs waited on the left side of the courtroom, each one representing a life currently held in the damp cells beneath the floorboards. The arithmetic of the day was simple and brutal. The prosecution would present fabricated or exaggerated evidence, the defense would offer perfunctory objections, and her father would deliver a sentence that served the economic interests of the county. Cordelia had memorized the docket, a list of names and accusations that she had spent the previous night committing to memory. 3 men accused of theft, 2 charged with inciting unrest, a woman suspected of poisoning, and 1 young man charged with forging freedom papers. She could not save them all. A mathematical reality that kept her awake at night, but she had already chosen the one she would try to reach. The memory of the first time she had acted, the impulse that had started this dangerous double life, surfaced unbidden in her mind. It had been a humid night 3 years prior, not unlike this one, when she had watched a young man named Amos dragged from the courtroom, his sentence of death by hanging over him like a shroud. That night, she had acted without a plan, driven by a frantic need to disrupt the inevitable. The details of that first rescue were blurry in her memory, a chaotic sequence of bribes and unlocked doors, but the feeling of Amos's hand squeezing hers in gratitude remained vivid. It was the first time she had felt powerful in a world that demanded her submission, and the addiction to that feeling had sustained her through 39 subsequent rescues. The bailiff's gavel crashed against the sound block, jolting Cordelia back to the present and signaling the start of the proceedings. All conversation in the gallery ceased instantly, the silence broken only by the shuffling of feet as the crowd settled in for the spectacle. Judge Vance emerged from his chambers, his black robes billowing behind him like the wings of a predatory bird, and ascended the bench with the gravitas of a king taking his throne. His eyes swept the room, pausing for a fraction of a second on Cordelia, and in that fleeting glance, she saw the cold calculation of a man who viewed his own daughter as just another subject to be ruled. The 7 prisoners were led in through the side door, chains rattling against the wooden floor, a discordant percussion that announced the beginning of the end. The bailiff's voice droned through the formal charges, but Cordelia's attention was fixed on the first prisoner, a man named Amos, who stood with his shoulders hunched against the inevitable. This moment, suspended in the stagnant heat of the courtroom, served as a mental trigger, propelling her consciousness back to a humid night in October of 1847. That was the date of her initial transgression, the night the abstract concept of resistance solidified into a terrifying, tactile reality. Historians examining the period often overlook the specific catalyst for the sudden drop in executions within Warren County, attributing it to clerical errors or corruption, but the truth lay buried in Cordelia's memory. She had watched Amos then, just as she watched the current prisoners now, realizing that the law provided no mechanism for mercy, only varying degrees of punishment. In the flashback that dominated her internal narrative, Amos had been a young field hand, barely 22 years old, sentenced to death for the theft of a medicinal tonic meant for his ailing sister. The trial had been a farce, lasting less than 20 minutes, with Judge Vance delivering the death sentence with the same detachment one might use when ordering supper. Cordelia recalled the visceral sensation of that moment, the tightening of her throat, and the sudden sharp clarity that her father's justice was nothing more than a preservation of property rights. She had returned home that evening in a state of suppressed hysteria, the image of Amos's hopeless face burning behind her eyelids, driving her toward a decision that would irrevocably alter the trajectory of her life. The rescue had not been born from a grand strategy, but from a desperate, frantic impulse. She had dressed in the darkest fabric she owned, a mourning gown left over from her mother's funeral, and crept out of the Vance estate under the cover of a moonless sky. Her destination was the county jail, a squat brick fortress situated near the river, where the dampness of the cells was said to rot a man's lungs within a month. She carried with her the only currency of significant value she possessed, her mother's ruby brooch, a piece of jewelry that had been in the family for 3 generations. It was a reckless gamble, staking her family heirlooms against the life of a man she did not know. Yet the alternative of doing nothing had become physically unbearable. The jailer that night was a man named Miller, a figure well known in the local taverns for his inability to hold drink and his mounting debts. Archival records from the period indicate that Miller resigned his post abruptly in late 1847, citing personal reasons, though local gossip suggested he had come into a sudden, unexplained windfall. Cordelia had approached him in the shadow of the jail's entrance, the brooch gleaming like a wound in the lamplight. The transaction was wordless for a long moment, a silent negotiation conducted with glances and the heavy breathing of a man torn between greed and fear. When she finally spoke, her voice sounded foreign to her own ears, steady and cold, as she demanded 1 hour alone with the condemned prisoner. Miller had ushered her into the cell block with a trembling hand, the heavy iron key turning in the lock with a groan that echoed off the damp stone walls. The air inside was fetid, thick with the smell of mold and human despair, a stark contrast to the perfumed parlors of her upbringing. Amos sat on a pile of rotting straw, his wrists chafed raw by the iron shackles, looking up with the hollow eyes of a man who had already accepted his death. When he saw the fine quality of her dress, confusion warred with fear on his face, for he could not fathom why a white woman of standing would venture into such a pit. Cordelia did not offer explanations or platitudes. She offered him a file wrapped in oilcloth and a chance, however slim, to see the sunrise. The escape itself was a blur of adrenaline and hushed urgency. She had watched from the shadows of the corridor as Amos worked the file against the iron bars, the rasping sound seemingly loud enough to wake the entire town. Miller remained at his post at the end of the hall, ostensibly looking the other way, though Cordelia knew his silence was purchased and fragile. The tension in those moments was a physical pressure, compressing her chest until she felt she might shatter from the weight of her own audacity. This was the point of no return she had crossed, a line that separated the passive observers of history from its active, dangerous participants. When Amos finally slipped through the loosened bars and vanished into the night, she felt a surge of triumph so potent it nearly knocked her off her feet. Returning to the present moment in the courtroom, Cordelia observed the current batch of prisoners with the hardened calculation of a veteran conspirator. The memory of Amos had served its purpose, reminding her that the system was not impenetrable if one was willing to pay the price. She noted the way the chains bit into the wrists of the second prisoner, a young woman accused of insubordination, and felt the familiar sting of impotent rage. However, unlike the girl she had been 3 years prior, she now possessed a network of contacts and a method honed through repetition. The initial frantic impulse of that first rescue had evolved into a disciplined methodology, a precise application of pressure applied at the weakest points of the judicial machine. Back in the narrative of the past, the morning following Amos's escape had brought chaos to the Vance household. Judge Vance had raged through breakfast, his face mottled with fury as he recounted the incompetence of the jail staff to his silent wife and terrified daughter. Cordelia remembered sitting with her hands folded in her lap, forcing spoonfuls of grits into her mouth while her heart hammered against her ribs, terrified that her guilt was written on her skin for all to see. Her father had ranted about the breakdown of order and the need for stricter oversight, never suspecting that the architect of his humiliation sat directly across the table from him. That breakfast marked the true beginning of her double life, the moment she realized she could deceive the man who claimed to see everything. The pattern established that night had repeated itself with variations over the subsequent years. She became a student of the jail's rotation schedule, learning the names and vices of every guard, identifying which ones could be bought and which ones were too loyal to risk approaching. She studied maps of the surrounding countryside, tracing routes through the Yazoo Delta and memorizing the locations of safe houses rumored to exist along the river. Each rescue required a new piece of jewelry from her mother's collection, a slow liquidation of her inheritance that her father had failed to notice amidst his preoccupation with political maneuvering. By the time she reached her 24th year, She had traded nearly $5,000 worth of gems for the lives of men the law had deemed disposable. The courtroom proceedings moved forward with agonizing slowness, pulling her back to the immediate danger. Judge Vance called for the first verdict, his voice booming against the high ceiling as he sentenced a man to 10 years of hard labor for a theft he likely did not commit. Cordelia watched the condemned man's face fall, the last flicker of hope extinguishing behind his eyes, and she felt the weight of the ledger she kept hidden in her room. That ledger contained 39 names, 39 lives she had snatched from the jaws of the system, but it also contained the weight of the ones she had missed. The mathematics of mercy were cruel and unyielding. For every life she saved, a dozen more passed through her father's court, untouched, their fates sealed by the stroke of his pen. A sharp nudge from a spectator beside her brought her attention back to the bench, where the judge was adjusting his spectacles to read the next charge. The tension in the room escalated as the second prisoner was led forward, a massive man whose defiant posture seemed to challenge the very authority of the court. Cordelia's fingers tightened around the edge of her Bible, her knuckles turning white under the strain. The memory of the first rescue was not just a history lesson, it was a blueprint for the present. As she watched her father prepare to deliver another sermon on law and order, she began to formulate the plan for the 40th name on her list, calculating the risks and resources with the precision of a general preparing for battle. The ledger, bound in faded green canvas and hidden beneath a loose floorboard in her dressing room, served as the silent accountant of her rebellion. Inside, Cordelia had inscribed 39 names in fading ink, a roll call of the damned she had snatched from the gallows and the auction block. Each entry contained precise demographic details stolen from her father's office: age, physical distinguishing marks, and the plantation of origin. Historians analyzing the Vicksburg vanishings of the late 1840s have often remarked on the precision with which these escapes were executed, noting the total absence of captures or traces. The ledger was not merely a record, it was a confession written in a code of her own devising, a document that would guarantee her execution if ever discovered by the wrong eyes. Judge Vance's suspicion had calcified into a paranoid obsession, manifesting in his obsessive scrutiny of the household inventory. He had noticed the gradual disappearance of his late wife's jewelry collection, yet he attributed the losses to the carelessness of servants or the phantom fingers of household staff, never suspecting his own daughter of liquidating the family assets to fund a clandestine war. The judge's blindness was systemic, a byproduct of a worldview that refused to acknowledge women as capable of complex political action. To him, Cordelia's sullen silences and frequent visits to the church mission were merely the eccentricities of a spinster daughter, traits to be managed rather than investigated. This intellectual arrogance provided her with the camouflage necessary to operate deep within enemy territory. The town of Vicksburg had begun to whisper among itself, spinning theories to explain the impossible statistics of the local penal system. In the taprooms and mercantiles, citizens spoke of a swamp phantom or a river witch who walked through walls to spirit away the condemned. Others muttered about northern abolitionists infiltrating the river ports, though no strangers had been seen. Cordelia moved through this miasma of rumor like a ghost, wearing her privilege as a disguise. She noted how the white community's fear shifted from the escaped prisoners to the invisible hand that guided them, a shift that made her heart race with a mixture of terror and fierce satisfaction. The mythology of her secret identity was growing larger than the reality, creating a buffer of disbelief that protected her. Obtaining the specific intelligence required for a rescue was a process of tedious accumulation, akin to assembling a mosaic from scattered shards of broken pottery. Cordelia spent her afternoons visiting the sick and the poor, a socially acceptable pastime for a lady of her standing, which allowed her to listen to the conversations of the enslaved community without arousing suspicion. She learned to read the subtle shifts in the domestic hierarchy, identifying which house servants could be trusted and which were loyal to the master class. This network of informants was her greatest asset, a fragile web of communication that relied on whispered warnings passed in the kitchens and stables. Every piece of information was a gamble, placing lives at risk for the chance of a larger victory. The financial logistics of the operation had grown increasingly complex as the number of rescues climbed. Bribing guards required hard currency, and the sale of her mother's brooches and rings could only stretch so far. Cordelia had turned to a local fence, a disreputable merchant named Mr. Silas Hooper, who dealt in second-hand goods and asked no questions about provenance. The transactions took place in the back of his dusty shop on Grove Street, where she traded diamonds and gold for the dirty banknotes that purchased freedom. The disparity in value was staggering. A diamond necklace worth $600 might buy the life of a man valued at $1,500 by the state, a calculation that laid bare the grotesque economy of human flesh. As the courtroom proceedings droned on, Cordelia's mind raced through the checklist of preparations for what would be her most dangerous operation to date. The jailer scheduled for the night shift, a man named Whitaker, was an unknown variable, younger and seemingly more principled than the drunken Miller. She had spent weeks observing his habits, noting his fondness for a specific tavern on the riverfront and the letter he wrote weekly to a mother in Tennessee. To compromise him, she would need to bypass his greed and appeal to a deeper, more desperate need. The complexity of the operation was escalating, requiring a level of psychological manipulation that exhausted her before the work had even begun. The ledger also served as a grim memorial to her failures, a silent testament to the limitations of her reach. Between the names of the saved were the names of the lost, men and women she had been unable to save due to timing or circumstance. She recalled the case of the Willis brothers in the spring of 1849, sold south to a sugar plantation in Louisiana before she could arrange transport. The weight of those failures pressed down on her, a heavy burden that counterbalanced the triumph of the 39 successes. This was the mathematics of mercy she had come to despise, a brutal calculus where saving one life meant accepting the loss of another as the cost of doing business. Her father's recent behavior, however, suggested that her window of operation was rapidly closing. He had begun to scrutinize her movements with a lawyer's eye, questioning her about her visits to town and demanding to know who she had spoken with. The New Year's ball had been a disaster, with him parading her in front of every eligible bachelor in the county, desperate to secure a marriage that would put an end to her eccentricities. Cordelia had dodged these marital bullets with feigned illnesses and fainting spells, but the charade was wearing thin. The judge's patience was a finite resource, and she could feel the noose of domestic expectation tightening around her neck with every passing day. The document hidden in her sewing basket, a list of safe houses mapped along the Yazoo River, represented her only viable exit strategy for the prisoners. She had drawn it herself, using ink mixed with berry juice to appear as simple sketches, a precaution against discovery. The route led north through the treacherous swamplands, eventually connecting with the network of Quaker sympathizers in Tennessee. Every rescue was a wager on this map, a bet that the geography of freedom was more powerful than the laws of Mississippi. As she sat in the courtroom, she traced the path in her mind, visualizing the terrain that would soon serve as the testing ground for her next beneficiary. The tension in the gallery spiked as the judge's gavel fell, signaling a recess before the final sentencing of the day. The crowd stirred, the collective sound of shuffling feet and murmured conversation breaking the hypnotic trance of the trial. Cordelia remained seated, her eyes fixed on the 7 prisoners who were being led back to the holding cells beneath the floor. She needed to see them up close, to catch a final glimpse that would allow her to select the one she would target tonight. The selection process was agonizing. A Sophie's choice played out in real time, where choosing to save one meant implicitly sentencing the others to their fates. Among the condemned, one figure stood out, a young man with ink-stained fingers and a defiance set to his jaw. He had been charged with forging freedom papers, a capital crime of intellect rather than violence. Cordelia recognized the spark in his eyes. It was the same fire she had seen in Amos and the others who had chosen to fight back. This man, identified on the docket as Isaiah, possessed a literacy that made him dangerous to the system and invaluable to her cause. Saving him would be a blow against the intellectual oppression that kept the institution stable, a statement that the mind could not be shackled as easily as the body. The courtroom began to empty, the spectators eager to escape the stifling heat and share their opinions on the proceedings. Cordelia rose slowly, smoothing the creases of her dress and arranging her face into a mask of dutiful compliance. She needed to intercept Whitaker before he took his post for the evening shift, a task that required her to leave the courthouse and navigate the social maze of the town streets. The next few hours would determine whether the ledger would receive a 40th name, or whether she would finally be exposed as the phantom that haunted Vicksburg. The stakes had never been higher, and the game she was playing allowed for no mistakes. The afternoon sun had shifted, casting long, distorted shadows across the courtroom floor as the bailiff called the room back to order. The psychological weight of the proceedings was palpable, a suffocating blanket of anticipation that settled over the spectators. Judge Vance resumed his seat on the bench, his expression one of bored superiority, as if the fate of 7 human beings was merely a tedious administrative duty. Cordelia sat rigid on the hard wooden bench, her eyes fixed on the prisoners who had been returned to the dock. The 7 figures seemed to blur into a singular mass of misery, but she forced her gaze to sharpen, separating the individuals from the collective tragedy. The selection process had begun in earnest, a silent audit of souls conducted under the guise of a concerned observer. The first prisoner called forward was an older man, his back bent from decades of labor in the cotton fields, accused of tampering with a gin mechanism. His hands shook uncontrollably as he stood before the bar, and Cordelia marked him as too frail for a successful flight through the swamps. The biology of mercy was cruel. Saving a man who could not walk 30 miles in a night was a sentence to a different kind of death in the wilderness. She watched the judge survey the man with cold detachment, his pen hovering over the sentence book. The architectural structure of the court demanded a victim, and the old man was a convenient offering to the gods of order. Her internal calculation ruthlessly eliminated him from the list of potential rescues. Next came the woman, a mother of 2 named Sarah, accused of poisoning a livestock trough in an act of misplaced vengeance. Her eyes darted around the room, searching for a friendly face or a miracle, finding only the hard stares of the planter class. Cordelia felt a pang of empathy, but the logistics of escaping with a woman were significantly more complex, given the restricted movements females faced on the roads. The judge's voice droned the verdict, guilty, with a sentence of sale to a traitor heading toward the Red River. The woman's silent weeping did not move the court, and Cordelia noted her name in the mental ledger of the lost, a heavy weight added to her conscience. The mathematics of the situation demanded she focus on the viable candidates, those with the physical strength to survive the extraction. The atmosphere in the room grew tense as the 3rd prisoner was shoved toward the dock, a young man with a scarred face and a defiant posture. He was accused of striking an overseer, a capital offense that struck at the heart of the social hierarchy. The crowd leaned forward, eager for the violence of a death sentence. Cordelia observed the man's clenched fists and the raw hatred in his eyes, recognizing a spirit that might break under the pressure of the swamp, or one that might fight its way through. Judge Vance glared down at the man, his own sense of authority challenged by the prisoner's refusal to cower. The judge pronounced the sentence of death by hanging, scheduled for dawn, a swift and brutal response to the crime of insurrection. The fourth and fifth prisoners were brothers, teenagers accused of stealing a boat in a futile attempt to reach the Free States. They stood shoulder to shoulder, their terror palpable in the stagnant air. Cordelia studied them with the eye of a tactician, assessing their youth and the bond between them. Saving one would condemn the other to a life of mourning, and the logistical challenge of extracting two untrained boys was staggering. The judge, perhaps in a mood of perverse mercy, sentenced them both to be sold to a plantation in Arkansas, separating them effectively but sparing their lives. The crowd murmured their approval at this display of justice, while Cordelia felt the hollow ring of the verdict. She could not save them all, and the brothers were a unit she could not fracture. Then came the giant, a man of immense stature who seemed to fill the space between the dock and the bench. He was accused of inciting a riot on the levee, a charge that carried the weight of economic terrorism against the river commerce. The man stood with his head held high, his chains seemingly inconveniences rather than restraints. Cordelia saw the potential in him, a leader, a figure who could rally others. But she also saw the target on his back. A man of his size would be impossible to hide on the back roads. The judge stared him down, a silent battle of wills before the gavel fell, sentencing him to a public whipping and life imprisonment in the state penitentiary, a fate designed to break his spirit slowly over decades. Finally, the seventh prisoner was led forward, the young man with the ink-stained fingers she had noted earlier. His name was read aloud, Isaiah, property of Dr. Henry Beauregard, charged with forgery and the theft of his own liberty. Unlike the others, Isaiah stood with a composed stillness, his gaze fixed on the judge. Cordelia leaned forward, her interest sharpened into a singular focus. Here was a man who possessed not just the desire for freedom, but the intellectual tools to pursue it. His crime was one of the mind, a falsification of documents that threatened the very legal fiction of slavery. This was the one, she realized, the 40th name for her ledger. The courtroom fell silent as Judge Vance addressed the prisoner, his voice taking on a tone of interrogation. He asked Isaiah where he had learned to write with such skill, noting the sophistication of the forged manumission papers. Isaiah's voice, when it came, was clear and articulate, a stark contrast to the mumbled pleadings of the previous defendants. He admitted to the crime, confessing that he had learned his letters from the doctor's own library. The admission was a strategic gamble, an acknowledgement of guilt that nonetheless highlighted the hypocrisy of a system that educated a man only to punish him for using that education. Cordelia felt a jolt of admiration for his composure. The judge's face flushed with irritation at the prisoner's eloquence, perceiving it as a mockery of the court's dignity. He offered Isaiah a choice that the spectators found unusual: a swift death by hanging, or a sentence to the Blackwood plantation in the Delta, a place notorious for its brutal regime and high mortality rate. It was a choice between a quick end and a slow, grinding extermination. The court held its breath, waiting for the breakdown, the plea for mercy that would satisfy their sense of superiority. The tension in the room stretched tight, a bowstring pulled back and waiting for release. Isaiah did not beg. He looked the judge in the eye and chose the plantation, stating that suffering was preferable to silence, for while he breathed, there was hope. The answer stunned the gallery into a momentary, stunned silence. Cordelia watched her father recoil slightly, his offer of a choice rejected by a man who refused to play the victim. The judge, recovering his composure, sentenced him to transport to Blackwood within the week, his gavel striking the wood with a finality that echoed through the hall. The prisoner was led away, but not before his eyes scanned the gallery one last time, passing over the crowd and locking, for a brief second, with Cordelia's. That fleeting connection was the signal she needed, a silent pact sealed across the crowded room. Cordelia exhaled a breath she hadn't realized she was holding, her mind already racing ahead to the logistics of the night. She knew the holding cells beneath the courthouse were manned by the inexperienced Whitaker, and she knew the transport to Blackwood was scheduled for the morning tide. The window was narrow, barely 8 hours wide, but the target was now clear. Isaiah was the one she would save, the man whose mind had dared to challenge the machinery of the state. As the crowd began to disperse, chattering about the day's entertainment, Cordelia remained in her seat, plotting the mechanics of a miracle. The return to the Vance estate was a slow procession through the thickening humidity of the late afternoon. Cordelia sat rigidly in the carriage, her hands folded in her lap to conceal their trembling, while her mind raced through the logistics of the coming night. The mansion loomed at the end of the oak-lined drive, its white columns gleaming with a deceptive purity that always struck her as a mockery. This house, with its expensive wallpaper and polished floors, was merely a gilded cage for a dynasty built on human suffering. Stepping onto the portico, she felt the weight of her father's expectations pressing down upon her, a physical burden that grew heavier with every passing hour. She had mere minutes to shed the role of the dutiful daughter and assume the mantle of the conspirator before the evening meal forced them into proximity once more. The dining room was set for an early supper, the silverware gleaming against the white linen tablecloth like a row of surgical instruments. Judge Vance sat at the head of the table, his posture erect, his appetite seemingly unaffected by the lives he had condemned earlier that day. Cordelia took her usual seat to his right, smoothing her napkin across her lap with mechanical precision. The silence between them was not peaceful, but rather charged with the static of unspoken accusations. Servants moved ghost-like around the table, placing bowls of turtle soup and platters of cured ham, their eyes averted to avoid catching the gaze of the master. The atmosphere was stifling, a vacuum of domesticity that threatened to suffocate Cordelia's resolve. Judge Vance broke the silence, his voice cutting through the clatter of cutlery like a blade. He inquired about her afternoon, asking if she had found the proceedings educational, a question laced with a subtle, probing irony. He noted her continued presence in the courtroom with a disdain that suggested her interest in the law was unbecoming of a woman of her station. He spoke of the dangerous elements in society, referencing the forger Isaiah with a particular venom that made Cordelia's skin prickle. He lamented the necessity of strict discipline, arguing that without the firm hand of the law, chaos would swallow the very civilization they enjoyed. His words were a test, designed to provoke a response that would confirm his suspicions or allay his fears. Cordelia responded with the practiced vacuity of a woman who knows nothing of the world's harsh realities. She murmured agreements about the fragility of order and the importance of family reputation, forcing the bland words past her teeth. She complimented the cook on the soup, a distraction tactic she had employed since childhood, to deflect her father's interrogations. Yet, beneath the veneer of compliance, a storm was brewing. The hypocrisy of his lecture on civilization, while presiding over a machinery of brutality, churned in her stomach, making the food taste like ash. She could feel her control slipping, the carefully constructed mask threatening to crack under the strain of his smug authority. The tension snapped when the judge mentioned her upcoming relocation to Charleston. He stated it as a foregone conclusion, an administrative decision designed to cure her melancholy and secure her future. He had apparently been in correspondence with a Colonel Wentworth, a man of substantial property and rigid principles, who was in need of a wife to manage his household. The judge spoke of the arrangement with the satisfaction of a merchant closing a lucrative deal, outlining the travel itinerary as if he were discussing the shipment of cotton. The reduction of her life to a transactional exchange, a mere merger of assets and bloodlines, ignited a fury that she could no longer suppress. Cordelia set her spoon down with a deliberate clatter, the sound echoing in the high-ceilinged room. She looked her father directly in the eye, abandoning the pretense of submission. She asked him, her voice trembling not with fear, but with rage, if he truly believed that shipping her away would solve the rot at the center of their family. She questioned the morality of his justice, describing it not as order, but as a mechanism for profit and pain. The words tumbled out, a dam breaking under years of suppressed truth. She accused him of blindness, of confusing cruelty with strength, and of using the law as a shield for his own avarice. The atmosphere in the room dropped, the temperature seemingly plummeting as the silence returned, heavier than before. The judge's reaction was swift and violent. He rose from his chair, the legs scraping harshly against the floor, and struck her across the face with a backhand blow that sent her reeling. The force of the impact knocked the breath from her lungs and left a ringing silence in her ears. The servants froze in the corners of the room, their eyes wide with terror, trapped in a tableau of domestic abuse. The judge stood over her, his chest heaving, his handprint blooming red on her cheek. He warned her, his voice low and dangerous, that she would not speak treason in his house, nor would she shame the Vance name with her radical sentiments. Cordelia touched her cheek, feeling the wetness of a split lip, but she did not cower. She looked up at him, and instead of the fear he expected, she offered a smile that was devoid of warmth. She told him, with a terrifying calmness, that the shame belonged to him and his gavel, not to her. She stood slowly, her legs unsteady, but her will unbroken, and informed him that she would not be going to Charleston. She declared her intention to stay and witness the consequences of his actions, a promise that carried a double meaning he was too blinded by anger to decipher. The defiance in her posture was a declaration of war, severing the last frayed bonds of filial loyalty. The judge's face turned a mottled purple, his hand reaching for a crystal decanter on the table as if to hurl it. He sputtered threats about the asylum in Jackson, about commitment papers signed by corrupt physicians, and about the utter ruin he would bring upon her if she defied him. He claimed he owned her, just as he owned the land and the people he sentenced, a slip of the tongue that revealed the true nature of his paternal love. He was a man accustomed to absolute obedience, and her rebellion was a fault line in the bedrock of his identity. The violence in his eyes was no longer just judicial. It was personal and total. Cordelia turned on her heel and walked out of the dining room, leaving her father shaking with impotent rage behind her. She climbed the grand staircase with a measured gait, fighting the urge to run, conscious of the servant's eyes burning into her back. Only when she had reached the sanctuary of her bedroom and turned the lock did she allow herself to slump against the door. Her heart hammered a frantic rhythm against her ribs, a mixture of terror and exhilaration. The bridge had been burned. There was no returning to the pretense of the obedient daughter. The confrontation had crystallized her purpose. She would save Isaiah, and in doing so, she would destroy her father's legacy. She moved to the vanity mirror, examining the swelling bruise on her cheekbone with a clinical detachment. The mark was a brand, a visible sign of the tyranny that ruled the household. She covered it with a layer of powder, not to hide it from herself, but to hide it from the world until she was ready to reveal her true self. The night ahead demanded clarity, not the distraction of physical pain. She opened the bottom drawer of her vanity, her fingers finding the secret latch that revealed the hidden compartment where her true life existed. The time for subtlety had passed. The time for open rebellion had arrived. She had a jailer to bribe and a man to free, and God help anyone who stood in her way. The confrontation in the dining room had shattered the fragile equilibrium of the Vance household, leaving Cordelia acutely aware that her time in Vicksburg was measured in hours rather than days. She moved through her bedroom with a sense of desperate urgency, pulling tapestries from the walls and rifling through drawers in search of anything that might aid her immediate flight. Her father's threats of the asylum were not idle. She knew he possessed the legal authority and the political connections to have her committed before the sun rose. It was during this frantic search for funds or escape routes that her attention was drawn to a heavy oak sewing box tucked beneath the chaise lounge. It was an artifact of her mother's life, a piece of domestic ephemera that she had previously dismissed as irrelevant to the brutal politics of the present. Inside the box, beneath a layer of yellowed lace and ivory knitting needles, lay a false bottom constructed with a craftsmanship that suggested professional secrecy. Cordelia pried the thin panel loose with the blade of her embroidery scissors, her breath catching as she revealed a stack of papers bound in blue ribbon. The documents were not the recipes or patterns one might expect, but a meticulous census of the local planter class, written in her mother's elegant, looping script. The list detailed the inventory of human property owned by the elite families of Warren County, recording names, ages, and skills with a precision that bordered on the obsessive. It was a ledger of the damned, compiled by the lady of the house, and its existence upended everything Cordelia thought she knew about her heritage. On the back of the inventory, dated April of 1838, was a letter addressed to a northern post office box in Philadelphia. The text was coded, referring to shipments of fabric and seasonal patterns, but in the context of the census, the meaning was unmistakable. Her mother had been more than a silent witness. She had been a chronicler of the system's sins, documenting the human cost of the wealth that built the Vance mansion. Cordelia felt a sudden, sharp connection across the divide of death, a recognition of a shared complicity turned into covert resistance. The discovery served as a validation of Cordelia's own rebellion, proving that the impulse to defy the judge was not a mutation, but an inheritance. The emotional resonance of the find was profound, shifting the ground beneath her feet. She had spent years believing her compliance was a betrayal of her mother's memory. Yet here was proof that the quiet woman who died of fever had been fighting her own silent war. The knowledge fortified Cordelia's resolve, transforming her solitary struggle into a continuation of a legacy. She sat on the floor amidst the scattered sewing supplies, the document trembling in her hands, and felt the weight of her isolation lift. She was no longer just a rebellious daughter. She was the carrier of a torch passed down through blood and silence. With the inheritance of her mother's secret came the realization that this intelligence was a weapon of mass disruption. The census did not just list names. It noted the locations of specific labor forces and the schedules of river transport. This data, when combined with her own knowledge of the judge's court, provided a blueprint for devastating economic sabotage. Cordelia realized that saving one man at a time was a palliative measure, a temporary salve on a gangrenous wound. The list offered the possibility of striking at the logistical heart of the slave economy, targeting the infrastructure that kept the institution profitable and resilient. The mental transition from individual rescue to systemic warfare happened in a heartbeat. Cordelia stood up, the exhaustion of the day replaced by a cold, burning clarity. She could not burn the entire institution to the ground herself, but she could cripple its local administration. The record of ownership in her hands was leverage, a map of targets for any sympathetic force willing to act. It was a resource too valuable to carry into the swamp, yet too dangerous to leave for her father to find. She needed to secure this information, to copy it, and transmit it to those who could use it, even as she prepared for the extraction of Isaiah. She quickly transcribed the most pertinent details into her own cipher, hiding the original document back in the sewing box. The task took nearly an hour, the scratch of her pen loud in the silent room, but the result was a condensed guide to the vulnerabilities of the local planter class. This copy she tucked into her corset, a shield of paper against the physical danger she would soon face. The discovery had provided a tactical edge she had lacked before, turning her flight into a strategic retreat rather than a panicked escape. The clock on the mantel chimed 9, signaling that the household staff would be retiring to their quarters. Cordelia changed out of her dinner dress and into the dark, serviceable clothes she had laid out earlier. The bruise on her cheek throbbed dully, a physical reminder of her father's violence, but the pain was now secondary to the mission. She loaded the pistols her father did not know she possessed, checking the powder and flint with hands that had learned to be steady. The guns were a last resort, a final argument against capture, for she knew that being taken alive would mean the end of her resistance. She moved to the window, looking out over the moonlit grounds of the estate. The stables were dark, but she knew the guards would be changing at the front gate. Her plan required her to slip out through the kitchen gardens, avoiding the main paths where the night watchmen patrolled. The route to the courthouse was dangerous, a gauntlet of dark alleys and potential informants, but the intelligence she now carried made the risk imperative. She was not just saving a life tonight. She was potentially igniting a much larger fire. The shadow of the Vance mansion no longer felt like a sanctuary. It was a tomb she was eager to escape. Cordelia took one last look at the room that had housed her childhood, knowing she would never return as its occupant. The gravity of her decision settled on her shoulders, heavy and absolute. She was about to commit a felony that would strip her of her name, her fortune, and her place in society. In exchange, she would gain her soul and the chance to honor the mother who had secretly paved the way. Stepping out into the hallway, she paused to listen for the sounds of her father's movements. The house was still, the judge likely drinking in his study, nursing his rage. She descended the back stairs, her boots making no sound on the carpeted treads. The domestic staff, loyal to her and fearful of him, had been subtly alerted to stay in their quarters. She reached the back door, the barrier between the prison of her past and the uncertain freedom of the night. The night air was cool against her skin, a relief after the stifling atmosphere of the house. Cordelia stepped onto the gravel path, the bag of supplies heavy on her shoulder. She had a map, a bribe, a pistol, and now, a mother's blessing encoded in a list of names. The target was the courthouse, and the prize was Isaiah. But the real victory would be surviving long enough to use the weapon she had just uncovered. With a final silent goodbye to the girl she had been, she melted into the darkness, walking toward the defining act of her life. The Vicksburg courthouse stood as a stark, geometric shadow against the ambient glow of the river lanterns. Cordelia approached the structure from the rear, moving through the overgrown plants of the alleyway that bordered the jailer's entrance. The humidity of the day had settled into a thick fog, obscuring the moon and muffling the sound of her footsteps. This building, which her father had lorded over for a decade, now appeared to her as a sleeping beast, its ribs full of unjustly condemned souls. She adjusted the satchel on her shoulder, feeling the weight of the iron file and the wrapped bundle of food supplies. The first phase of her final operation required navigating the human obstacle of the night watchman, a man named Whitaker, whose reputation for piety made him a far more complex target than the greedy Miller. She found Whitaker seated on a wooden crate near the heavy oak door, a Bible open on his knee, illuminated by a sputtering lantern. He was younger than she had anticipated, his face smooth and unmarked by the cynicism that usually plagued men in his position. Cordelia paused in the shadows, composing her features into a mask of aristocratic distress. The performance required a delicate balance. She needed to convince him of her authority while simultaneously exploiting his compassion, a combination that had served her well in her previous, smaller manipulations. She smoothed the fabric of her dark dress and stepped into the circle of light, allowing the lantern to catch the sheen of her bonnet. Whitaker shot to his feet, the Bible snapping shut in his surprise. He stammered a greeting, clearly unsettled by the appearance of the judge's daughter at such a late hour. Cordelia wasted no time with pleasantries. She claimed that a servant had stolen a family heirloom, and that she had tracked the thief to the holding cells, demanding to search the premises before her father discovered the loss. It was a flimsy lie, one that relied entirely on the man's reluctance to question the social hierarchy. Whitaker hesitated, his eyes darting between her face and the heavy door he was sworn to guard. He mentioned regulations and the judge's strict orders regarding visitors, his voice tight with the anxiety of a man trapped between duty and class obligation. Sensing his resistance, Cordelia shifted her tactics, dropping her voice to a conspiratorial whisper. She reached into her reticule and withdrew the bankroll she had prepared, $300 in crisp notes, a fortune for a man of his station. She did not offer it as a bribe, but as a donation for his discretion and Christian charity, framing the corruption as an act of virtue. Whitaker stared at the money, the internal struggle visible in the tightening of his jaw. He spoke of his mother in Tennessee, a woman whose failing health required medicines he could not afford, a detail Cordelia had learned from her network of informants. The money was not for him, but for life itself. The transaction was completed in silence. Whitaker took the notes with a trembling hand, tucking them into his shirt pocket without counting them. He unlocked the heavy door, the metal mechanism grinding in the quiet night, and gestured for her to enter. He warned her that she had only 20 minutes before the roving patrol passed by, a deadline that injected a sudden, sharp urgency into her movements. Cordelia nodded, her heart hammering against her ribs, and stepped into the fetid air of the jail corridor. The smell of stale urine and rotting straw assaulted her senses, a physical manifestation of the system she sought to dismantle. The corridor was dimly lit by a single taper, casting long, dancing shadows against the damp brick walls. She moved quickly, counting the cell doors until she reached the third, on the left, where the docket indicated Isaiah would be held. Through the rusted bars, she could see a figure sitting on the stone floor, knees drawn to his chest. Isaiah looked up at the sound of her approach, his eyes wide with a mixture of confusion and fear. He did not recognize her, or perhaps he did, but the sight of a well-dressed white woman in the depths of the jail was an anomaly that defied immediate comprehension. Cordelia wasted no time on explanations. She produced the iron file from her satchel and passed it through the bars, her movements practiced and efficient. She whispered instructions, telling him to work on the hinge bolts rather than the lock, as the iron there was older and more brittle. Isaiah took the tool, his fingers brushing against hers, the contact electric with shared danger. He asked her why she was doing this, a question that hung in the heavy air. She answered simply that his life was worth more than the paper that condemned him, a statement of heresy that sealed their pact. While Isaiah worked the file against the metal, the sound, a harsh scraping that seemed deafening in the confined space, Cordelia outlined the escape route, She spoke of the drainage tunnel that led to the river bank, a detail she had gleaned from old architectural plans in her father's library. She provided him with a map drawn on oilskin, marking the safe houses along the Yazoo River, and a packet of dried meat. The planning was precise, stripped of all emotion, focused entirely on the mechanics of survival. Every second counted, the grinding of the file marking time like a morbid clock. The bolt gave way with a dull snap, and Isaiah pushed the door open, the hinge swinging free. He stepped into the corridor, a man reclaiming his physical agency. Cordelia handed him the dark coat she had brought, a garment that would conceal his tattered clothes. He hesitated for a moment, looking at her with an intensity that transcended the situation. He offered her gratitude, but she cut him off, reminding him that gratitude was a luxury they could not afford. The only thanks she required was his survival and his continued fight against the system that had caged him. She led him back toward the entrance, where Whitaker stood with his back turned, staring resolutely at the opposite wall. The guard did not look at them as they passed, his complicity complete in his refusal to witness. Cordelia and Isaiah slipped out into the foggy night, moving quickly away from the courthouse and toward the tree line that marked the beginning of the swamp. The extraction was a success, but the night was far from over. As Isaiah disappeared into the shadows of the woods, heading toward the river, Cordelia turned back toward the town center. Her task was not yet finished. While Isaiah fled, she had one final act of destruction to perform. She made her way toward the county clerk's office, a separate building adjacent to the courthouse. Inside lay the property deeds, the bills of sale, and the transcripts that formed the legal skeleton of slavery in Warren County. She withdrew a flask of lamp oil she had concealed in her satchel and began to pour it along the foundation of the wooden structure. The liquid seeped into the dry timber, a dark stain against the grain. She struck a match, the flame flaring bright orange in the darkness, and dropped it onto the soaked wood. The fire caught immediately, a hungry orange tongue licking up the side of the building. Cordelia watched for a moment as the flames began to grow, consuming the records of ownership that had bound generations of families. The blaze was a signal, a beacon of chaos that would divert attention from the escape route Isaiah was taking. By the time the town bells began to ring the alarm, the clerk's office was fully engulfed, sending sparks spiraling into the night sky like angry fireflies. Cordelia turned her back on the inferno and melted into the shadows, leaving the burning edifice of her father's authority behind her. The district was waking up, shouts echoing in the distance, but she was already gone, a ghost moving toward her destiny. The chaos of the burning clerk's office provided the perfect diversion for Cordelia to slip away from the town center unnoticed. She traversed the darkened roads leading away from Vicksburg, her body fueled by a mixture of adrenaline and stark terror. By the time the first light of dawn began to bleed into the eastern sky, she had put nearly 15 miles of muddy terrain between herself and the judge's estate. The plan had been to secure passage on a northbound steamer, but the arson had likely sealed the port, forcing her to improvise a route along the narrow country roads. Her immediate goal was a coaching inn near the Benton Crossroads, a place where she could secure a horse and blend into the early morning traffic of farmers and merchants. She arrived at the inn as the sun crested the horizon, her dark cloak pulled tight to obscure her face. The establishment was already bustling with activity, the air thick with the smell of coffee and bacon. Cordelia kept her head down, moving to the stables to negotiate for a mount. The stable hand, a boy barely in his teens, looked at her fine boots with suspicion, but was placated by the silver coin she pressed into his palm. As she led the horse out into the yard, a coach and four rattled into the inn's courtyard, the driver shouting for a fresh team. It was the public stage to Jackson, a route that would take her further inland, away from the river patrols. Cordelia made a split-second decision, abandoning the horse she had just rented in favor of the relative anonymity of the public coach. She approached the driver, paying the exorbitant fare for a private cabin with money she had taken from her father's study. The driver, a grizzled man with a kerchief tied around his neck, barely glanced at her before ushering her inside. The cabin was cramped, smelling of dust and old leather, but it offered a degree of concealment. She stowed her satchel beneath the bench and leaned back against the cushions, finally allowing herself to exhale. The escape from the town was complete, but the journey through the gauntlet of Mississippi had only just begun. The coach rattled along the rutted road, the suspension offering little respite from the jarring motion. Cordelia watched through the gap in the curtains as the landscape rolled by. Endless fields of cotton, the white bowls stark against the dark earth. They were nearing a narrow bridge over a tributary of the Big Black River when the vehicle began to slow. The driver shouted something unintelligible, and the sound of heavy hooves pounding the earth grew louder, vibrating through the floorboards. The coach came to a shuddering halt, the horses whinnying in protest. Cordelia's hand flew to the pocket where she kept her pistol, her heart leaping into her throat. The door was wrenched open, revealing a figure silhouetted against the bright morning light. 4 men on horseback surrounded the coach, their faces obscured by bandanas, rifles leveled at the driver. The leader, a tall man with a wide-brimmed hat, gestured for her to step down. It was a classic setup for a robbery, a frequent hazard on the lonely roads of the Delta. Cordelia stepped into the dirt, her mind racing through her limited options. To reveal herself as the judge's daughter might invite kidnapping for ransom, but to play the helpless traveler might simply result in the loss of her funds and her weapon. The leader dismounted, his boots kicking up dust. He approached her with a swagger that spoke of confidence and contempt. He demanded her money and her jewelry, his voice a low growl. Cordelia reached into her pocket, but instead of retrieving her purse, she gripped the stock of her pistol. Before she could draw, the man laughed, a dry, humorless sound. He reached up and pulled down his bandana, revealing a face that was strikingly familiar. It was the scarred visage of Jeremiah, the man she had watched her father sentence to a living death in the penitentiary years ago. The recognition was mutual and electric. Jeremiah's eyes widened as he took in her features, the undeniable resemblance to the man who had condemned him. He whispered her name, not as a question, but as a revelation. The other bandits lowered their rifles slightly, sensing a shift in the dynamic. Cordelia stood frozen, the pistol suddenly useless in her pocket. She was at the mercy of a man she had failed to save, a ghost from her ledger of failures. She waited for the knife or the bullet, the punishment for her inability to reach everyone. Jeremiah did not strike her. Instead, he reached into his saddlebag and withdrew a crumpled piece of paper, which he thrust toward her. It was a wanted poster, freshly printed, the ink still dark and heavy. Her own face stared back at her, rendered in a crude woodcut. Below her image, in bold letters, were the charges: arson, inciting insurrection, and theft. The reward listed was $500, dead or alive. Judge Vance had wasted no time in turning his daughter into a fugitive, prioritizing the law over his own blood. Jeremiah studied her reaction, his expression unreadable. He asked her if she had been the one to burn the records office. The fire had been visible for miles, a beacon of rebellion that had sent the planter class into a frenzy. Cordelia met his gaze and nodded, admitting her crime. The admission changed the atmosphere among the bandits. The men glanced at each other, with a mixture of surprise and respect. She was no longer just the judge's daughter, or a potential victim. She was a fellow saboteur, a weapon turned against the masters. The leader of the group, a man named Tobias, who sat atop a roan mare, spoke up. He recognized her from the court proceedings, where he had been sentenced to a chain gang for the crime of literacy. He revealed that they were not simple bandits, but a cell of the real Underground Railroad, a network of escaped slaves and freedmen who fought back with force rather than stealth. They had been watching the roads, looking for fugitives, and had stumbled upon the architect of the courthouse fire. Jeremiah extended his hand, not in threat, but in invitation. He told her that she could not go to Jackson, nor could she return to Vicksburg. The net was closing, and every slave catcher in the state would be looking for the woman on the poster. He offered her a choice. She could continue on her path and likely be caught by nightfall, or she could come with them. They were heading to a camp deep in the Yazoo swamps, a fortress of resistance where her knowledge of the planter class would be invaluable. It was a recruitment, not a rescue, a demand to trade her privilege for a life of hardship and war. Cordelia looked at the wanted poster in her hands, then at the faces of the men who had every right to hate her father. She realized that her previous life had been erased in a single night, replaced by a new identity forged in fire and ink. The mathematics of mercy had shifted again. She was now one of the hunted, dependent on the very people she had tried to save. She took Jeremiah's hand, her grip firm and resolute. She told him to lead the way, surrendering her destiny to the underground network. The journey into the Yazoo Delta was a disorienting passage through a landscape that seemed to resist human intrusion. Jeremiah led the group along forgotten game trails that dissolved into the murky waters of the swamp, requiring them to dismount and lead their horses through chest-deep sloughs. The air was thick with the drone of insects and the decay of vegetation, a stark contrast to the manicured order of the Vance estate. Cordelia's fine riding boots, once a symbol of her status, were now caked with mud and ruined by the brackish water. The physical degradation was a necessary toll for the safety the isolation provided, stripping away the last remnants of her aristocratic exterior. After hours of winding through the labyrinth of cypress knees and hanging moss, the terrain solidified into a hidden hummock of dry land. The camp emerged from the shadows like a mirage, a collection of rough-hewn cabins and lean-tos arranged in a defensive perimeter around a central fire pit. It was a bustling, organized community, far removed from the desperate, small-scale hideouts Cordelia had imagined. Scouts moved through the trees with silent efficiency, and the sounds of industry, hammering, sewing, the sharpening of tools, filled the air. This was not merely a refuge. It was a base of operations for an army that the state of Mississippi refused to acknowledge existed. As they entered the clearing, the inhabitants paused their work to stare at the new arrival. The sight of a white woman in their midst caused a ripple of unease, a natural reaction for people who had only known white faces in the context of violence or ownership. Cordelia felt the weight of their scrutiny, realizing that her skin color, which had protected her for 24 years, now marked her as a potential liability. She straightened her spine, meeting their gazes with a steady resolve, silently signaling that she came as an ally, not an overseer. The silence was heavy, broken only by the crackling of the central fire. Jeremiah escorted her to the largest structure in the camp, a cabin that served as the headquarters for the leadership. Inside, the walls were lined with maps of the river systems and charts detailing the patrol schedules of the local militia. Behind a rough table sat a woman whose presence commanded immediate respect. She was older, her hair a crown of silver, and her hands bore the calluses of a lifetime of labor. This was Aunt C, the de facto general of this hidden fortress, a woman whose tactical brilliance was whispered about in the quarters of plantations across the state. Aunt C regarded Cordelia with a look of piercing assessment, her eyes missing nothing. Not the ruined dress, the determination in the set of her jaw, nor the fear she tried to suppress. The older woman acknowledged the arson at the clerk's office with a curt nod, noting that the destruction of property records had caused chaos among the landowners. However, she questioned Cordelia's place in this war, asking if she sought absolution or action. It was a challenge, a probe to determine if the judge's daughter was made of steel or merely glass. Cordelia responded with the honesty that had become her only currency. She admitted that she sought neither forgiveness nor safety, but the complete dismantling of the system that had raised her. She spoke of the network she had built and the intelligence she had gathered, offering her knowledge of the planter class's vulnerabilities. Aunt C listened without interrupting, her expression unreadable. The tension in the room was palpable, a negotiation between the old world and the new that Cordelia was trying to forge. The mentor then revealed the true scope of their operation. She explained that the Underground Railroad had two branches, the one that moved people quietly north, and the one that stayed to fight. Aunt C commanded the latter. She unfolded a map of the Mississippi River Valley, pointing to the supply lines and economic arteries that fueled the slave economy. Her strategy was not just liberation, but devastation. To make the business of slavery so costly and dangerous that it would collapse under its own weight. It was a doctrine of total war that dwarfed Cordelia's individual acts of mercy. Cordelia studied the maps, realizing that her previous efforts, while noble, had been insufficient. The rescue of individuals was a palliative measure, but the destruction of the system was a cure, however violent. She traced the lines of the river with her finger, understanding that she held the key to disrupting the trade. Her insider knowledge of the shipping manifests and the judges' schedules was a weapon these fighters lacked. She turned to Aunt C and pledged her allegiance to the cause, promising to use her mind as a weapon of insurgency. Aunt C accepted the offer with a grim finality. She warned Cordelia that there was no retreat from this path. To leave the swamp was to face the noose, and to stay was to face the bullet. The camp was a point of no return, a place where the past was burned away. Cordelia nodded, accepting the terms of her new existence. She was no longer a Vance. She was a soldier in a shadow war, stripped of her name and her history, defined only by her actions moving forward. Jeremiah, who had been standing silently by the door, stepped forward to welcome her formally. He handed her a rough canvas shirt and a pair of sturdy trousers, replacing the ruined silk of her former life. The gesture was symbolic, a shedding of the skin of the oppressor. Cordelia took the clothes without hesitation, retreating to a corner to change behind a blanket. When she emerged, she looked less like a lady and more like a survivor. The transformation physical as well as psychological. The integration into the camp began immediately. Cordelia was assigned a bunk in a communal cabin and given a roster of duties that included guard rotation and map making. The work was hard and the days were long, but she found a strange peace in the exhaustion. She was surrounded by people who had suffered under the laws her father enforced, yet they accepted her presence with a cautious grace. The initial suspicion began to fade as she proved her worth with a pen and a rifle, earning her place through shared labor. As night fell over the swamp, Cordelia sat by the fire, cleaning a rifle that had been entrusted to her. The sounds of the forest surrounded her, no longer frightening, but protective. She thought of Isaiah, now miles away on his journey north, and the burning courthouse she had left behind. The transition was complete. She had walked into the swamp as a fugitive fleeing a crime, but she would walk out as a commander in a revolution. The war for the soul of Mississippi had begun, and Cordelia Vance was finally on the right side of the battlefield. The Beauregard plantation stood as a monument to calculated cruelty, its vast fields of cotton stretching toward the horizon like a white shroud. Cordelia Vance lay prone in the dense underbrush at the edge of the tree line, the damp earth seeping into her clothing as she studied the layout through a pair of battered field glasses. The target was the main dock on the Yazoo River, where a barge was currently being loaded with the season's harvest, estimated at over $40,000 in value. Aunt C had tasked her with leading this raid, a test of her commitment to the violent economics of revolution. The plan was complex, requiring synchronization between the fire teams and the evacuation units, a ballet of destruction that left no room for hesitation. The humid air clung to the raiders concealed in the foliage, their breaths shallow and controlled. Cordelia surveyed her team, a mixture of escaped bondsmen and hardened abolitionists, and saw the tension in their eyes. They were not soldiers by trade, but by necessity, forged in the fires of oppression. She had spent the previous 3 days drilling them on the timing, ensuring they knew the precise moment to strike. The goal was twofold: to reduce the plantation's financial infrastructure to ash and to extract as many enslaved workers as possible under the cover of the ensuing chaos. It was a high-stakes gamble that risked lives for the sake of a strategic blow against the local economy. Cordelia raised her hand, giving the pre-arranged signal to Jeremiah, who led the flanking team. The operation commenced with a terrifying silence. 2 shadows moved toward the lamp oil storage shed near the dock, their movements invisible against the backdrop of the night. Cordelia counted the seconds in her head, her finger resting lightly on the trigger of her rifle. The quiet was shattered suddenly, as a wall of flame erupted from the shed, the fire consuming the oxygen and roaring skyward with a hunger that mirrored the raiders' anger. The night sky turned a violent orange, illuminating the panicked figures of the overseers and the dockhands. As the fire spread to the stacked cotton bales, chaos engulfed the riverbank. The plantation's militia, confused and disoriented, scrambled to form a defensive line, their shouts drowned out by the crackling inferno. Cordelia ordered the extraction team forward, and they surged from the tree line, heading for the slave quarters to guide the workers toward the waiting boats. The air was thick with smoke, and the smell of burning fiber, stinging the eyes and lungs. Cordelia advanced with them, her rifle raised, providing cover for the vulnerable group making their break for freedom. The firefight began in earnest when the overseers regained their composure and opened fire from the cover of the main house. Bullets whizzed through the smoke, tearing into the earth and splintering the wood of the dock. Cordelia returned fire, her aim steady, targeting the muzzle flashes in the darkness. The reality of combat was a stark contrast to the theoretical discussions in the swamp. It was loud, chaotic, and brutally final. She saw one of her team members stumble and fall near the water's edge, a casualty of the war she had helped instigate. Amidst the screaming chaos, Cordelia's attention was caught by a small figure standing frozen near the burning dock. It was a young girl, no older than 8, separated from the fleeing adults and paralyzed by the terrifying spectacle of the fire. Without a thought for her own safety, Cordelia broke from her cover and sprinted toward the child. The heat from the burning cotton was intense, singeing her hair and drying the sweat on her face instantly. She reached the girl, scooping her up just as a section of the burning roof collapsed nearby, sending a shower of sparks into the air. As she turned to retreat with the child clinging to her neck, a searing hot poker of pain tore through her left shoulder. The impact spun her around, the force nearly knocking her to the ground, but she managed to keep her footing. Blood began to soak through her shirt, warm and sticky against her skin. Gritting her teeth against the agony, She clutched the girl tighter and stumbled back toward the safety of the tree line, firing her pistol wildly with her good arm to keep the attackers at bay. Jeremiah appeared out of the smoke like an avenging spirit, grabbing Cordelia by the waist and hauling her toward the extraction boats. The raiders were retreating in good order, the precious cargo of human lives secured in the flat-bottomed skiffs. The plantation owner, a man named Beauregard, stood on the ruined dock, shaking his fist at the retreating figures, his wealth dissolving into the river. The raid had been a tactical success. The cotton was gone, the records were burned, and the system had been dealt a painful blow. Back in the swamp, the mood was somber, but victorious. Aunt C personally attended to Cordelia's wound, extracting the bullet with a pair of heated tongs. The pain was excruciating, a physical price for the liberation she had facilitated. C noted that the wound would leave a scar, a permanent reminder of the night the judge's daughter became a soldier. Cordelia accepted the wound as a badge of honor, a brand that marked her final separation from her past life of comfort and complicity. Reports filtered in over the following days. Isaiah had successfully reached the Free States, and the economic impact of the Beauregard fire was rippling through the planter class. The raid had demonstrated that the resistance was capable of striking at the very heart of the slave economy. Cordelia lay on her cot in the recovery cabin, listening to the sounds of the camp preparing for the next operation. She realized that her journey from the gilded cage of the Vance mansion to the mud of the Yazoo swamps had been inevitable. She had burned her bridges, both literal and metaphorical, and found a purpose that was worth the burning. The narrative of her life had been rewritten in the language of ash and blood. She was no longer a symbol of Southern gentility, but a threat to the very foundation of the South. As she drifted into a fevered sleep, she saw the faces of the 39 men she had saved, and the countless others she would fight for in the years to come. The war was far from over, but for the first time, she was not a passive observer or a secret conspirator. She was a combatant, fully committed to the cause, and the revolution had only just begun.